It's not reciting the music that you play, that you read, that you decipher, that you understand, you analyze, you follow your intuition or your teacher's explanation, hyphenating the spot between the dead composer and your discovery of the piece in a way that you will discover how to play the piece. Not only because how it's written, but how it means to you. And there are little innuendos that are expected, a rubato, delayed suspension, or possible grace note, which adorns a special note, which is in an imitative, narrative, singing melodic line. So these things are not all indicated in the score. The pedaling, which is mostly harmonic, but the melodic also gets enticingly harmonized, and sometimes you can bring out a specific voice and follow drop by drop through the bars a continuous development of a suggested line which will build up the flow of the narrative story further than only tension released by a group of 2, 4, 8 bars, if it is in this kind of post-classical early romantic organization of statement, spaces and pacing, and the way of translation of tension release, dissonance, consonance, rising, dropping, intervals, step motion, sequence with reproduction, circle of fifths in harmonic motion, and then of course punctuation, cadential point, the moment to want to go further, eventually improvise. Of course, is not allowed today, but it's not meant to be just an eccentricity. It's just it's a blossoming of the line a little beyond what is notated, which was part in the 19th century of the expectation, in terms of the fact that the interpreter was not a recitant, as I said earlier, but was a reteller of the story, or an actor who tells the written text, embodying it and giving it a soulful presence, which inevitably can take some freedom with the exact notation of the text. And here it's a pace, but it's a pulse, but it's a phrase, but it's rhythmic. But there is a direction of line, a build-up of tension, and there is a chromaticism if it is not a syncopation or 2 against 3. So many ingredients that spice the storytelling, that keep the attention of the listener, as if to say, of course you use words, but then you organize them in series of words, which become then phrases and stanzas and stuff. And I find that it is true that while we recite detail by detail every note, because we study it, and every note is precious, because this is the composer we want to best serve, because we love this composer or this piece, and others too, and we enter in this circle of those who play this piece, and we want to leave the mark of what it means to us. And to a certain extent, to be humble, we shouldn't do much, and to be perhaps more narcissistic, we'll insist on the ritenuto, or insist on the grace notes by spreading them one way or another, because it's unmeasured and it's left to us. Now, of course, we are not then and we are now, so we are recreating the then in the now, and the then, a lot of things were done in the innuendo between the notation, which was not very detailed, even if very so already some more than, of course, oral transmission, but still a lot of it was in the way it was put alive, brought to statement. And today we have to recreate how much is not too much, what is right, what is wrong, the good taste, the bad taste. They couldn't have done too much of this, but they should have this, but they didn't bring out this because this part is not indicated with a stem up or down. And of course you can then creatively start to combine dots and think that there is some kind of other dimension to the storytelling that allows you to bridge it in an arched phrasing. And you can say that there's too much freedom. After all, if I don't like the piece, I should write my own, as my teacher used to say. And I didn't try, but if you play the piece, you have to play it as it's written. And I tried, and I still do, and try to help the students not disrespect the texts. Every note is the complete life's experience of the composer in it. So it's a chosen note. It's not there accidentally instead of another one. Everything is chosen. The displacement of the rhythm or the creating an anxiety or expectation, the ranges, the spread of the chords, even if they're too large for any hand, regardless. And no, they didn't think, oh, we write for piano, we should be limited by what can be done on the piano. They thought string quartet, aria, opera, and why not? And so, of course, the importance of spreading the texture is so important for them that they suggest to us, this is an ideal, we cannot reach it, you can't either, but try to find ways. And I think that is what is so creative for the interpreter, not to rewrite the piece, but to retell the piece. And when we are prisoners or fearing or in self-censorship in front of a score, and we're afraid to do the wrong thing every note we play, we end up by reciting it, but we're not retelling it. And there is a difference. You can do it with respect for the text, but with a free horizon line that is perhaps enhanced by what you hear. It's not a theoretical, I can speak like that, but in fact, once you start playing, the sounds create the sounds, creating the harmonies, the melodic lines, the phrasing, the structure. You are brought on the wings of the bird and you soar in the sky and you feel like a sentence shouldn't end. It's a run-on sentence, and regardless of the indications of hairpin dynamic markings or where is the ritenuto and where is not, altogether I think it's all about getting very profoundly involved in the piece as if you wrote it, because it means to you. Of course, music is made to be reimagined, reinterpreted. That means translated etymologically. It factly is something so beautiful and should be so natural. Because in the first place, the reason for which somebody gets involved in music is because something calls him or her. And this call could be called intuition or talent or some kind of a hidden sense that becomes a necessity. And of course, then on the process, you learn how to by learning. So you read, you organize, you exercise, you repeat, you practice until you become better at a specific way of bringing the piece to life. But ultimately, the reason for which in the first place you entered in the music exchange with a work of a composer from another era whose expression or emotion or thought process can be meaningful to you outside of the geographic and time zone of this composer's composition. And there is a universality in the message, but there is a temporality in the notation, and there is a deciphering necessity with intelligence score reading to connect dots where they're not hidden but somehow hinted. I find that that is the place of a creative interpretation which serves while renovates in a way with a new point of view the statement of the composition. It's not about being faithful to the music, the score, the notation, rather than the writing, because it's a difference. The notation is a way of figuring out the elements to be produced from the thought of the composer after his or her death. And then the performers who will take this and put it back alive from the pager. Of course, the page is not necessarily giving all the information, but that's why you study, to learn about how people are supposed to have done the grace notes in the past, the pedaling in the past, the direction of the line in the past, the rubato in the past. The idea of improvising here and there, and how much was it just to embellish, or is it to develop, or in a way to consider that the score's notation is the departure point and your interpretation is another arrival point than the one that is in the notation. Those things are very important, subtle, and ethical. Ultimately, as a teacher, your responsibility is to transmit to the student the capacity, the awareness, the desire to serve strictly and very thoroughly and honestly the composer's ideas to the details of their notation. And when there is doubt, try to find other ways of doing it. Perhaps you can compare it to other pieces, listen to other works of the same composer, find similar situations, because often the toolbox of a composer at the time was not extremely large, because they had to write a lot to survive and kept in this stylistic unity through their life, at least most of them. Subtlety, complexity, beauty was in the fact that while they wrote many pieces, they tried constantly to rethink, at least for some of them, the very ways of organizing the statement of the narrative storytelling. Schumann's incredible syncopations become an offbeat, which is its own beat. And then you enter in some kind of the listener is brought in almost into a musical vertigo, because you don't feel like there is any downbeat to settle on, like you would do in a march or in a waltz. And of course, the idea of displacing the beat becomes so important, because the syncopation is a way to create a tension which will reach its point of arrival with a downbeat ultimately somewhere. Perhaps not right away, but somewhere. Beethoven's 101 does that in the opening movement. It's a lot of displacements. And of course, you have to count the beats in your head as if you're your conductor, while you play where they are placed off the beat, in order to create that tension between you and the piece, because if not, you play on the beat and there is no tension. Of course, you have the decay of the instrument. On the piano, you cannot make a vibrato, ta, ti, like a singer could do. You do ta, ti, and if you know it's ta, ta, hum, you think the hum on the beat and you play the ta, ha on the offbeat. And then you create a sense of continuum in this parallel universe of displaced beats, which, when longly connected, become, in a way, their own downbeats. There is so much you can lure the listener that this is not the beat. In the opening of 109 of Beethoven, it starts on an upbeat, but every beat is alike. And so he purposely blends in so you don't know as a listener without the score if you start on an up or down beat. What does it matter, right? Not much, except that the phrasing is the organization of the statement. And the statement demands certain words to be more meaningful, because they are in the narrative storytelling, they are the ones who define the storytelling. And so the spacing between the words for an actor on stage are very much the way a musician spaces some arrival points or departure points. and therefore the pulse compared to the rhythm is a separate issue. And if you want to bring down with a tenuto or a little light accent in the melodic line of the opening of 109, that the next beat is the downbeat, then you play lighter the first beat because it's not the downbeat, which is supposed to be the heavy beat. I know that sounds very silly, in a way simplified, overly simplified, almost caricaturized when said like that. But in fact, the difference with the listener is that unless they know the piece, they don't visualize the score. And when you play for them, as a performer, you have visualized the score. Perhaps you have heard the piece first on your own before you have looked at the score, because very often we hear music before we read it or you're able to play it. And when you look at it, you realize that it's not what you heard. So you wonder, did they all misread before me? Or am I the first one to notice a discrepancy between what I read in the notation, in the organization of the phrase, up and down beat, syncopation, rubato, indications for suspensions and realizations of how to organize the grace notes or the grouped arpeggiated notes. And you realize that in fact there is a discrepancy between the notation and what really comes out, either by tradition, either by expression, and same thing with the voicing in the same hand of two parts. They blend. I'm blind. That was a little bit of a... No, it's not blind, it's blend. And if you close your eyes, you listen to the voices and you think, oh, in the same octave, in the same hand, they combine, at least. That's the word more appropriately. But if you really want the listener to not combine them intuitively or verticalizing their hearing of the two hands playing more than only two parts in most cases, but in those that are close to each other in space, then you do. You bring out one and you play the other one in the shadow, chiaroscuro, the light and the shadow and the dark. Because the piano is an instrument that doesn't have instrumental timbres. It's not a synthesizer, it's a synthesizer. It's a piano, but it's evocative of so many things. The way you phrase, organize the voicing, the layering, the flow of it, and the follow-up of it. And you don't combine what you don't want to be combined. And perhaps the composer intuitively left it to you by saying, if you combine it, that's okay. But if you voice it, that's better, because then it gives the capacity to the listener to follow what you bring them. In other words, there is a portion of education in your performance for an audience, because of the way you follow, organize, manage all the different elements that you're presenting, even if they're sandwiched in the same chord by the writing or the notation or both. I find it to be fascinating, because the teacher then can bring so much more to the student than only the play what's written, of course. But that's not the omega, is the alpha. Start from what is written and figure out what you want to present for it and how you're going to use it to become your statement. It's totally alive. And if you do a rubato, don't search immediately where you're going to restitute what you stole in the time. Perhaps you let it just by your intuitive structuring to organize that in a way that is not immediate, tat for tat, you know. And if not, then don't stay always very strictly in the rhythm, because that then doesn't leave the music to express its living motion. It's a subtle combination of hints without exaggeration, respect of the text without recitation, understanding of the intended effect by the different notational devices in the composer's score for what you would like to organize it to be. In other words, you speak it, you sing it, you play it, you phrase it, you legato it, you non-legato it, you everything. You have to bring a coherence on the spot, sometimes intuitive, sometimes analytically prepared, because that's why you rehearse, you replay, you rehear, until you find how to best shape it. But every time you replay it, some of these elements don't come out the same. The acoustics, the instrument, yourself. So there are variables that adjust to the point where every interpretation time is a little bit different, even if the intentions are clearly the same. Once you've established what tempo you want compared to what's written and what you're told, what you heard around and what you think is appropriate, or your technique, or the instrument's response in terms of action of the piano. And then once you find that osmosis between all this, then you go through the piece in your storytelling, and in the process, some things work like planned and some not. And you cannot just stop and start. You have to take it as it comes and make it as if it was planned. And sometimes this beautiful way of free speech brings you to a moment where the piece comes alive, literally alive, with a planned and hopes, but plans and hopes, and also with the unexpected, which spices all.